The air in the conference room felt heavy, not grand. The blinds had been drawn halfway, leaving stripes of sunlight across the faded carpet. A pot of neglected office plants sagged in the corner, their leaves yellow at the tips, as though even they knew what was coming. I sat in the chair I had occupied for 2 decades, not as a guest, but as the day's agenda item. The CEO adjusted his tie and began the script. After careful consideration, the company has decided it's time for fresh energy. His tone was flat, the kind used in quarterly memos that no one reads. Around him, executives shifted in their chairs, some fiddling with their coffee cups, some staring down at their phones. Only the veterans, the ones who remembered the garage days, dared meet my eyes. Their jaws were clenched, their expressions taut with unspoken protest. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the tears they wanted. Instead, I closed the black notebook I'd carried since the first project and placed it gently in front of me. That small act of control made the silence more unbearable than any outburst. Life has a way of testing us, doesn't it? Take some time to relax with a warm cup of tea. Tell me, where are you watching from? And if this story speaks to you, tap like and subscribe so we can share more moments together. Then Dylan entered. The CEO's son strode across the room like an actor arriving late to his own premiere. He dropped into my chair without hesitation, his cologne arriving before his words. His suit was expensive, but his posture was sloppy, as though power had been delivered to him in a gift box. "It's my system now," he announced, grinning directly at me. It wasn't triumph, it was insult. A ripple of unease spread through the room. The veterans stiffened, others fidgeted with pens, pretending not to hear. They all knew the system was no toy, but not one of them challenged him. As I slid my notebook into my bag, my phone buzzed. On the screen, a single message appeared from a familiar number. "The circle hasn't forgotten." I lifted my eyes, catching the subtle nod from one colleague across the table. His hands were folded, his face blank to anyone else. But the message was clear. We were still bound by something deeper than corporate titles. Humiliation seared through me as I stood and walked out. But beneath it, something sharper stirred memory, loyalty, and a secret Dylan would never understand. I walked out of that boardroom with humiliation burning in my chest. But by the time I reached the parking garage, the anger had cooled into something else. Memory. The stale smell of oil and concrete reminded me of a different time, when everything was still fragile, when we worked out of a borrowed garage with second-hand chairs and one server fan that never stopped humming. Back then, there was no hierarchy, no heirs waiting in the wings. There was only the circle. We didn't call it that at first. We were just 5 overworked employees trying to keep a dream alive. But as the company grew, we made a pact. It was late one night, pizza boxes scattered, our fingers numb from coding. One of us said, "What happens if they forget who built this?" That silence that followed was answer enough. So, we buried a safeguard deep inside the architecture of the system. It wasn't documented in manuals, wasn't even whispered in staff meetings. A governance layer requiring the signatures of the original circle to unlock the core. It was insurance. But more than that, it was dignity in code, a quiet reminder that we existed. Now, years later, walking alone with my notebook clutched to my side, I wondered if that safeguard still lived beneath the billions they had stacked on top of it. Was it still breathing under all the upgrades? Or had someone overwritten it in the name of progress? My phone buzzed. A new message appeared. Plain text, but encrypted in a way only I would recognize. I stopped mid-step, my pulse quickening. The subject line read, "Founder key still alive." I leaned against the cold concrete wall, staring at the screen. It was signed with a code phrase only the circle knew. Something we had joked about when we first tested the system. 5 hands. 1 lock, for a moment. My humiliation from the boardroom softened. The circle wasn't just a memory. At least one of them still remembered. Still had my back. But hope is never clean. Doubt crept in almost immediately. Who had sent it? Marcus. Who once called the system our digital child, or Lila. who had been offered a director's title she swore she didn't want. Could it be Paul? The one with a mortgage big enough to tempt betrayal. I wanted to believe loyalty was unbreakable, but 20 years in corporate halls had taught me better. People change when money and power knock at their door. What if the circle had already been compromised? One by one, sold to the highest bidder still. As I tucked my phone away, a small ember glowed inside me. The text meant the safeguard remained. Somewhere, beneath the arrogance of Dylan and the silence of executives, the circle's code still pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. For the first time that day, I straightened my shoulders. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as they wanted me to believe. The first week after my exit, Dylan paraded around the office like a conqueror. He moved through the open floors with the swagger of someone who believed the world had been handed to him. Employees were forced to stand straighter when he passed, offering smiles that didn't reach their eyes. He mistook their silence for respect, when in truth it was survival. Dylan liked to sit in my old chair during operational reviews. He leaned back, fingers laced behind his head, tossing around phrases like scaling up efficiency and next-gen optimization. Words he didn't fully understand, but enjoyed hearing out loud. The room would fill with nods, though most were mechanical, offered out of fear rather than agreement. But arrogance has its cracks. I began hearing whispers almost immediately. My system didn't bend easily to his touch. Each day, he tried to make decisions that looked good on the surface, but revealed his lack of depth. A permissions file altered incorrectly here. A client configuration ignored there. Small errors at first, brushed off with a smile and a shrug. Then came the email from an international bank. Flagged urgent, a $20 million transaction had failed midstream. The error read, signature mismatch. To the untrained eye, it was just a glitch. But to those who understood, it was a red flare in the night sky. The circle's safeguard had brushed against his arrogance. Instead of pausing to investigate, Dylan went on the offensive, in the middle of the operations floor. His voice cut across the cubicles. "This is on you," he barked at the IT director. "A man with 20 years of service. You've been sloppy. You're slowing us down." The director flushed red, stammering that the logs showed no fault on his end. Others glanced nervously at their screens, unwilling to step in. The tension was palpable, thick as humidity before a storm. The veterans in the room exchanged quick looks, subtle, but enough to tell me, had I been there, that the circle's presence still lingered among them. Dylan, though, doubled down. He ordered the IT director to fix it or pack his things, as though threats could bend code to his will. The room fell quiet. It wasn't the silence of respect, but of people choking back words they couldn't afford to say. Behind his swagger, unease crept in. He tapped his pen too often, paced when he thought no one was looking. He knew something was wrong, even if his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. A system worth billions doesn't simply reject a signature unless it's programmed to demand something more. The arrogance on his face told one story, the tremor in his hand told another, and for the first time, the company began to see the difference between a leader who had built the foundation and an heir who believed he was entitled to it. It didn't take long for the small glitches to grow into something that could no longer be brushed aside. On a Tuesday morning, just past 9, an international contract worth $400 million froze mid-execution. At first, the staff thought it was just another temporary delay. Systems sometimes hiccup under heavy traffic, but when the monitors across the IT floor lit up in red, one by one, the illusion of control shattered. The words on every screen were stark, almost mocking, founder key missing. Alarms weren't blaring, but the silence was worse. Rows of analysts rushed to their keyboards, fingers flying as they tried to override. Reroute, restart. Someone knocked over a coffee cup, and the liquid spread across the desk unchecked. No one cared. The air was hot with panic, though no one dared to say it out loud. Dylan stormed into the operations floor, his voice booming, "Why is this still down? Fix it!" His tone was desperate, but wrapped in anger. A flimsy disguise. The IT staff avoided his eyes, each glued to their screen. One young engineer whispered, "It's not us. The system won't accept the signature." The phrase spread like static through the room. For every failed attempt, the same message returned: founder key missing. It wasn't an error code, it was a verdict. The floor itself seemed to pulse with tension. Emergency lights flickered as the network cycled, bathing the office in red strobes. People darted between desks, clutching cables, handing off printouts. From above, the executive windows looked down on chaos that no press release could possibly conceal. In the boardroom, the CFO watched from behind the glass. His knuckles whitened around the pen he held. Though he didn't write a single word, he had always been cautious, the one to question risk before anyone else dared. Now, watching Dylan stumble through commands he barely understood, the truth pressed hard against him. This wasn't leadership, it was theater. The CEO's son wasn't steering the ship, he was drilling holes in its hull. But the CFO also knew the cost of speaking aloud. To challenge Dylan was to challenge the CEO himself, his position, his career. Maybe even his financial security were tied to silence, so he sat rigid in his chair, mouth shut. While the thought gnawed at him, she would have known what to do. Juliet built this. Juliet warned us. On the floor, Dylan grabbed the IT director by the collar of his voice, spitting accusations. Your incompetence just cost us millions. The director, red-faced, insisted. It's the system, it doesn't recognize us. His words only deepened the quiet terror seeping through the staff. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. The system wasn't broken. It was rejecting them. The panic was no longer hidden in the code or the flashing lights. It lived in the darting eyes, the hurried steps, the tight jaws of people who understood more than they dared admit. Something deeper was at play, and without Juliet Carter, the foundation was cracking wide open. You're still with me. Right. What do you think is going to happen when a system worth billions keeps rejecting its own leaders? Drop your guess in the comments. By Thursday afternoon, the panic could no longer be contained behind closed doors. The $400 million freeze was spreading, paralyzing other contracts, and the investors were demanding answers. The CEO's phone buzzed nonstop. Every time he hung up, another call lit up the screen. His jaw clenched tighter with each unanswered question. Finally, the board gave the order no one wanted to admit: bring Juliet back. The message reached me at home. It was phrased politely: urgent consultation, but the subtext was clear. They weren't asking. They were desperate. For a moment, I let the silence hang between me and the glowing screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let them drown in the chaos they had chosen. But another part, the one that had built every line of code, couldn't walk away without at least looking them in the eye one more time. When I arrived at headquarters, the energy was different. Gone was the smug confidence of the week before. The lobby, usually buzzing with chatter, was hushed. Employees avoided Dylan's gaze as he marched me toward the boardroom, his designer shoes clicking too fast against the tile. He opened the door with a flourish, trying to mask unease with arrogance. She's here to save us. That's pathetic, Dylan sneered, his voice echoing across the long table. He leaned back in the chair he had claimed as his throne. The picture of entitlement. The executives shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mix of exhaustion and hope. They had seen him stumble. They had seen the system reject him. Now their eyes darted toward me, as if the balance of the room had tilted with my entrance. But I wasn't alone. Behind me stepped Marcus, one of the oldest veterans of the circle. His hair was grayer now, but his presence still commanded respect. Gasps moved around the table. Marcus hadn't set foot in this building in months, having been sidelined when Dylan rose. His sudden reappearance was a signal stronger than words. The circle was not just memory. The CEO's face drained of color. "Marcus," he whispered, as if the ghost of loyalty past had walked in. Dylan forced a laugh. "What is this, some reunion tour? We don't need relics." His eyes locked on me, voice sharp. "You're outdated. Juliet, you don't belong in this room anymore." But the insult landed flat. The veterans in the room quiet. observant, were no longer pretending. They leaned forward slightly, waiting. The CFO's pen, idle for days, began to scratch across the paper again. Even the IT director, still bruised from Dylan's public humiliation, sat taller in his seat. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Dylan's words filled the air, but my silence held more weight. For the first time since my dismissal, I felt the current changing direction. Power wasn't in titles or bloodlines. It lived in credibility, in memory, in the quiet return of those who had built the foundation. And as Marcus took the seat beside me, I knew Dylan's smirk was no longer the loudest voice in the room. The boardroom felt like a pressure chamber the moment I sat down. The long table was lined with restless executives, their laptops open, their eyes darting between me and the giant monitor fixed to the wall. Dylan leaned back with his usual smugness, though his tapping fingers betrayed the unease he couldn't fully hide. Marcus sat quietly beside me, a steady presence that grounded me even as my pulse hammered in my ears. The CEO gestured impatiently toward the screen. "Show us, Juliet. If you're as essential as they say, prove it." His words were brittle, the voice of a man who had run out of options but refused to admit it. I opened my leather notebook and entered the sequence I had written down years ago, an unassuming string of commands that only the circle would ever recognize. The system came alive, the monitor glowing with shifting lines of code. For a few seconds, the room was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the server feed. Then the message appeared, sharp and final across the screen, awaiting all founder signatures. A collective gasp moved through the room. Some leaned closer, as if proximity could change the reality in front of them. The CFO whispered under his breath, "It's real." I felt every eye on me, but I kept my gaze steady. "This is the safeguard we built. The system will not release full access without the original circle," Dylan scoffed, though his voice cracked slightly. "Then that's easy. We already have them." He snapped his fingers at the IT team. One of the engineers entered a digital key, a signature file that lit up green on the screen. Then another, and another, for a moment. I almost believed it could work. 3 of the old signatures registered, one after the other. But then, when the 4th file uploaded, my stomach dropped. I recognized the encryption pattern instantly. It was Paul's. Paul, who had been beside me in the garage years ago. Paul, who used to call our late-night coding sessions the trench. Paul, who once told me he would never let the company sell out the people who built it. 15 years of trust collapsed into a single betrayal glowing on the monitor. The system beeped, acknowledging his key. Signature accepted. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. My mouth was dry, but I forced the words out. "You bought him." Dylan smiled, cruel and triumphant. "Everyone has a price, except maybe you. But we'll see." The veterans in the room stiffened. Marcus's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the table. He didn't speak, but his eyes met mine, steady, almost apologetic, as if to remind me that not all loyalty was for sale. The tension was unbearable. The room was split in two, those who still believed in the circle, and those who feared its unraveling. And in the middle of it all, I sat with the bitter taste of betrayal on my tongue, knowing that even a fortress built on trust could crack from within. The room was suffocating in its silence. On the screen, Paul's signature glowed green, accepted without hesitation. Dylan's grin widened as he leaned forward, his hands spreading across the table like a victor claiming territory. "There it is," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "That's all we needed. The circle's just an old myth. And now we own it." Executives let out shallow breaths, some even nodding, desperate to believe the nightmare was finally over. The CFO closed his notebook, as though willing the crisis to be solved by Dylan's bravado. For a split second, the boardroom tilted toward false relief. Then the system beeped. A harsh, mechanical tone cut through the room. The screen flashed red, words sprawling across it like a sentence carved in stone. Invalid original architect required. The room froze. It was as if the air itself had been pulled out of the space. The executives, who had almost smiled, now sat paralyzed, their faces pale. Dylan blinked once, then again, his grin collapsing into a snarl. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice cracking. He slammed his hand against the table so hard that the water glasses trembled. "It's supposed to work. We had the key." I sat still. My notebook closed before me, my hands folded. I didn't need to say anything. The system had spoken louder than I ever could. Dylan spun on me, his face red, sweat glistening at his temple. "She's irrelevant," he screamed. "She's nothing. This company moved on without her. And it will move on again." His voice reverberated across the glass walls, spilling into the hall outside. A few employees walking past stopped and stared through the window, their expressions a mirror of the chaos within. But no one moved. No one came to Dylan's rescue. The CEO finally broke, his mask of calm leadership shattering. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles bone-white. "Dylan," he said, his voice low, almost shaking. "You told me this was handled. You told me we had control." Dylan wheeled around. "We do. This system is broken. It's her fault. It's all her fault." The accusation fell flat, even to his own ears. The truth was carved in digital code for everyone to see. No signature mattered except mine. The bitterness of it hit me like a slow burn. Paul's betrayal, Dylan's arrogance, the CEO's cowardice, 20 years of sacrifice. And this was what loyalty bought: silence, denial, and sold-out trust. I wanted to rage, but instead the ache settled deeper, heavier. Trust wasn't just broken, it was traded like currency. And now, even as the system defended me, I felt the sting of how fragile belief in people truly was. Around the table, no one dared speak. The only sound was Dylan's ragged breathing and the steady pulse of the screen, still flashing its verdict: invalid original architect required. The boardroom felt like it was holding its breath. Dylan paced the length of the table, his polished shoes striking the floor in sharp, angry beats. "Run it again," he barked at the IT director, who looked pale under the fluorescent lights. Fingers flew across keyboards, commands entered, lines of code flashing up the giant monitor. Each attempt ended the same way: rejection. But Dylan wouldn't let go. "Try again. Override the error. Bypass it, whatever it takes." His voice grew harsher with each failed attempt. Desperation cloaked in authority. Sweat beaded along his forehead. But he forced a grin each time, as though he could intimidate the system into submission. The room was silent, except for the rapid clicking of keys and the soft hum of machines. Executives leaned forward, their shoulders tight, eyes darting from Dylan to the screen. No one dared speak. Even the CEO sat rigid, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Every second stretched, taut as a wire ready to snap. Then, suddenly, the monitor shifted. The lines of rejection disappeared, replaced by a single phrase: "access temporarily granted." The silence shattered. Applause erupted around the table, loud and eager, relief spilling from every executive who had been suffocating under days of tension. The CEO exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging as though he had been carrying the weight of the company on his back. He even managed a weak smile. Dylan seized the moment like a crown. He raised his arms, triumphant, soaking in the approval like sunlight. "There you go," he said smugly, his grin wide. "Crisis averted. I told you I could handle it." He slapped the IT director on the back, ignoring the man's rigid expression, and turned to the others. "This is what leadership looks like." The room buzzed with false hope. Laughter and chatter filled the air, as though a war had just been won. Some executives even clapped Dylan on the shoulder, eager to align themselves with what they believed was victory. But then the monitor flickered. At first it was faint, a soft stutter in the display that drew a few frowns, but no real concern. Dylan kept talking, his voice rising above the noise. See, it was just a matter of willpower and focus. That's how you get things done. The flicker returned. Stronger this time. The chatter faltered, heads turning back to the screen just as the phrase vanished. New words blazed across the monitor in bold. Undeniable letters. Primary key missing original architect. The room went deathly still. Applause choked into silence. Relief curdled back into dread. The CFO leaned closer to the CEO, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet cutting through the quiet like a blade. It's her. It's always been her. The CEO's eyes dropped, his face ashen. Around him, the executives who had cheered moments earlier now sat frozen, the false victory collapsing into a deeper fear than before. And at the head of the table, Dylan's grin fell apart, his triumph erased by the one truth he could never outmaneuver. The room was still trembling from the false victory that had just collapsed. The words, primary key missing, original architect, glowed on the monitor, bathing the boardroom in a harsh white light that felt almost accusatory. Dylan's smirk was gone. The CEO's face looked drained, the lines around his mouth deeper than ever. Everyone sat frozen, waiting for anyone to move. I rose from my chair. The scrape of it against the floor cut through the silence like a blade. Dylan's eyes darted toward me, wide, panicked, then quickly narrowed into defiance. "Don't you dare!" he hissed, but his voice had lost the weight it once carried. I walked to the monitor with measured steps, each one echoing in the stillness. My leather notebook rested against my side, steady in my hand. I could feel the eyes of every executive tracking me, as if my movement alone would decide whether the company stood or fell. At the screen, I entered the sequence, the key I had held back all these years. The code ran across the monitor, clean and precise, until the system stopped and presented its verdict: one founder's key missing, original architect. Then, slowly, it identified me by name. Gasps broke out around the table. Executives leaned forward, whispering, their faces pale with realization. Dylan staggered back a step as if the floor itself had betrayed him. The CEO did not move at all. He sat stiff in his chair, his mouth slightly open, as if words had abandoned him. I turned, calm in the eye of their storm. My voice was steady, almost soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You bought loyalty, but not mine." The sentence landed heavier than any shout. It was the truth, undeniable and final. Dylan snapped, his composure shattering. "This is ridiculous," he bellowed, pounding the table with both fists. "She doesn't matter, I'm the one in charge now." His voice rose, desperate. But no one answered, no one nodded, no one stood behind him. The executives who had once feigned agreement now kept their eyes low, unwilling to lend him even the comfort of false support for the first time. Dylan stood alone. The silence that followed was deafening, thicker than any argument he could throw. The CEO finally lowered his gaze to the table. Unable to meet my eyes, his authority had dissolved along with his son's arrogance. I let the silence linger, then closed my notebook. The sound was soft, but final, like the last note of a requiem. The system had spoken, and so had I. The boardroom was drowning in noise. Voices rose, accusations flew, papers scattered across the table. Dylan was red-faced, shouting until his throat cracked, while the CEO sat rigid, his authority unraveling before everyone's eyes. I stayed still for a moment longer, notebook closed firmly in my hands. Then I turned. Without a word, I walked away from the chaos. The sound of my heels on the polished floor cut clean through their shouting, each step taking me further from the mess they had created. I did not look back. As the heavy door shut behind me, the world changed. The glass muffled their voices until they were nothing more than distant echoes. Ahead of me, the hallway stretched long and quiet. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, washing the floor in golden patterns. The contrast was striking inside that room, a storm of panic and betrayal. Out here, calm, balance, For the first time in 20 years, I felt weight lifting from my shoulders. I paused in the corridor, letting the light fall across my face. It wasn't just a hallway, it was a threshold. Behind me was the noise of arrogance and corruption. Before me was silence, and the dignity they could never take away. My phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced at the screen. A message appeared, short but powerful. "It's done. They can't touch us anymore." It was from one of the circle. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A faint smile crept across my face, soft and unhurried. The kind of smile that comes not from victory alone, but from survival, from finally being free. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and resumed walking, each step lighter than the one before. My reflection followed me along the glass wall, no longer the weary shadow of someone discarded, but a woman restored. For 2 decades, I had carried their demands, their dismissals, their quiet humiliations. Now, with nothing more than silence and truth, I had left them in ruins. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar, it waits, steady and patient, until the right moment to speak. And maybe that's the lesson here, no matter how long it takes. Dignity can't be erased, and truth will always find its way to the surface. What about you? Have you ever carried quiet strength until the moment it mattered most? Share your story in the comments. Tap like if this chapter spoke to you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Together, we keep these stories alive.